Hello, I'm Alan Taylor, and I want to talk to you about a new program I discovered recently, ClassMana. But before I get to it, we have to jump in the Wayback Machine and go back in time. I started teaching as an adjunct professor at several colleges around the Boston area back in the mid 1980s. I then started teaching at the elementary and middle school level full time back in 1994. I first got interested in educational technology came after working for Research Information Systems, a software company based in Carlsbad, California, back in the late 1980s to 1993. It was a great small software company that created a bibliographic software program known as Reference Manager. As their director of international sales, I got to travel around the world promoting the software. Upon returning from a trip to Japan, I learned that the company was acquired by a larger company, ISI, in Philadelphia. Why do I mention this? Well, it was my first real experience of a smaller fish getting eaten by a larger fish, which would lead to its eventual extinction. A lesson I would learn over and over again. I got interested in combining my interest in technology with my interest in teaching. This led me to my first full-time teaching position as a computer teacher. One of my first favorite software products I used with students was SimTown. What was nice about it came with an educational guide, including handouts. I used the game with students as a cross-curriculum activity. They would track what they were building, the number of people, jobs, types of businesses, as well as the cost for all these things, which utilized math skills. They would need to be mindful of where they built things and the environmental impact related to science. I also had students keep a diary of their thinking as they built and grew their town. I also had students assemble into small groups, discuss their progress, and make recommendations to each other. It was a big hit with the students. Eventually, SimTown disappeared. I left that district and moved to another one. I was teaching grades K to 5. Two programs stood out to me and still hold fond memories. I introduced younger students to Pajama Sam. Pajama Sam was great fun for students. It was a series of point-and-click and puzzle games that had to be solved. Students need to solve the various puzzles to move through the game. It was so popular that many students purchased the game to play at home. By 2000, there were 3 games in the series. One student enjoyed Pajama Sam so much that they came to school dressed as Pajama Sam for Halloween one year. I liked the idea that students had to think about things to solve various puzzles. It was also great to see their excitement when they solved one of the puzzles and could move on. The program was a good lesson on thinking things through and not simply trying to race through the program to reach the end. It was a good lesson on dealing with disappointment and frustration and finally working through those to solve a puzzle. Sadly, the creators of Pajama series, Humongous Entertainment, went through multiple acquisitions and somewhat disappeared, though it's still available on Steam, Nintendo Switch, and PlayStation Store. With older students, grades 3 to 5, I turned to HyperStudio. I can't recall how I first came across HyperStudio, but I like the idea of students being able to create their own multimedia projects. I even set up a 74-step guide to learn how to use HyperStudio. By going through the steps, they were quickly on their way to being authors of their storytelling projects. Students just thought it was so cool how they could create their own cards, which would include text, audio, and video. They also thought it was cool that they could create buttons that would move from card to card. Once all the projects were completed, I would take the class projects and create a CD for each of the students to have with all the projects from their class. When HyperStudio was first released, it was only available for the Mac. I was fortunate enough to be able to beta test for their Windows version and was happy when it was released. I continued to use HyperStudio for several years until it faded into the background. In 2008, Makiv.com took over the development of the program and released version 5. It was great to see its return after several years without development. When version 5.1 was released, the text could be exported as HTML5. Then, in 2012, Apple unveiled iBooks Author, a program that would allow you to create your own multimedia books that could include widgets easily. Around 2014 or 2015, HyperStudio Author was released. With momentum building for iBook Author, there was a number of companies building widgets that could easily plug into the program. HyperStudio Author offered the option of creating widgets or HTML5 files. When version 5.3 of HyperStudio was released, you could take a HyperStudio file and directly open it in HyperStudio Author. Today, HyperStudio still exists out there, but has not been developed any further. It no longer runs on newer Macs and has problems running on Windows 64-bit systems. Another great program fades into the dust. My dissertation was titled Using a Moodle to Leverage Technology Integration. Moodle was a great tool to use in a classroom, but I wanted more. I now jump to the year 2015. I was presenting at several conferences that year, and my focus of most of my presentations were on using and integrating apps into the classroom. One of the apps that I reviewed was ClassCraft. I really hadn't used it yet, but thought it would be very interesting to take a look at. The thing that struck me about ClassCraft was the idea of gamification of the classroom and how to better get kids to be more involved and invested in their own learning. In the fall of 2016, I introduced ClassCraft into my social studies class. Why? Well, one of the problems I had was getting students settled at the beginning of the period. Students would move from classroom to classroom. When they came into my class, it would take me a while to get them settled and focused. Precious time would be lost each day on getting them going. When students entered the classroom, we would start with random events. It was amazing how quickly they would get settled. They couldn't wait to see the random event would be. When it came to choosing a student or group, I used Wheel of Destiny to pick one. The White Mountain countdown tool was great for students to be aware how much time was left in the period. When it came time for pre-test reviews, the boss battles was a big hit. Students took to it immediately. They loved it. In fact, they would go to other sixth grade teachers and ask, why aren't you using it in your classroom? This led me to training other teachers on how to use ClassCraft in their classroom. I then began to create short videos on introducing ClassCraft and how to use the various components of the program. On my consulting Moodle website, I even created a course on utilizing ClassCraft in the classroom. I became a ClassCraft ambassador and was one of the beta testers when they first started developing a Quest module. When the Quest module was released in October of 2017, I began taking lessons that I had already created and built them into Quest. This was a true way of really integrating technology in the classroom. Class would begin with our usual random event, and then students would get into their groups and begin to work on their quests. This allowed me the opportunity to work around the classroom with various groups and individuals. Now, one of my problems was as students worked in groups, the volume would get louder and louder. I would have to constantly remind students to keep the volume down. Then one day, it hit me like a bolt of lightning. Why not use the Macus Valley, the volume meter? It worked perfectly. No more having to stop every so often to remind students to keep their volume down. In 2018, I presented at several conferences on the use of ClassCraft, and in November of 2018, I presented a webinar for ClassCraft on how I was using ClassCraft in my classroom. In June of 2019, I retired from teaching, but I still kept active with ClassCraft. I was teaching some online courses and utilized ClassCraft as well as Moodle. It was a sad day in June of 2024 when ClassCraft closed down after being acquired by HMH. Another small fish eaten by a bigger fish. I couldn't really find anything to replace it. I also began to think about, is it possible for me to work with others to develop a replacement for ClassCraft? After a while, I realized, well, it's a little bit over my head and began to search on the internet for replacements for ClassCraft. I spent some time looking on the internet to see if there was anything that was close to what ClassCraft could do. And I eventually gave up for a while because nothing seemed to match it. And then I discovered ClassMana. It had all the features that I came to love about ClassCraft already there. And as I mentioned before, the most important of all the modules was the Quest module. At least to me, it was the most important. I'm really excited to begin to work with it and share tutorials on how to use it as I go along. I'm sure the program has brought a lot of joy back into the lives of teachers that have used ClassCraft. I know it has for me, and I don't even teach anymore. I just do educational consulting. So look for my tutorials to pop up soon. So for all you ClassCraft users of the past, now's your chance to jump aboard and give ClassMana a try. Thanks for listening, and if you have any questions, feel free to contact me at ajtaylor@techandedonline.com. Thanks for listening.